Hey, welcome to the Art Condition Podcast, a weekly show that will discuss the business, community, and often undiscussed stress and mental health concerns of being a professional artist, or even a serious hobbyist. I'm Joby. I've been in the tattoo and illustration professions for 25 years. My co-host is Moose, a data analyst, social media manager, and art agent. If you enjoy the content, please consider visiting the Patreon page in the show notes to help support the effort. Or if that's not an option, please like, subscribe, leave a good review, or just share with your friends. And definitely go visit the links of our guests on this episode. Thanks for listening, and have a great day. This week we are talking to Shane McInnis. Shane is a history professor and Twitch streamer. Every Thursday he gives free history lectures on his stream, and his wide-ranging knowledge of our past is profound, and there are many valuable insights for artists. When we are creating visual imagery with the intent of telling a story and stir emotion, we are speaking to the common threads that unite us as human beings. Humans are storytellers. It is the defining characteristic of our nature. And history is the story of all stories. It is the story of those common threads. While it might be true that there is nothing new under the sun, there are still infinite ways that old ideas can be recombined in original ways, and history is the ultimate source for that inspiration. And thus, historians are the ultimate storytellers. So please listen to our conversation with Shane, and then follow him on Twitch. Shane is non-judgmental, impartial, and has a real talent for making the ancient stories he tells relevant and relatable. We would all be wiser and better off to hear people like Shane speak about the past, ask him questions, and find new insights, and find new ways to make more connections with our fellow humans.
I don't do this nervous. I talk for a living, man.
That's right. And we're going to talk to you about everything that you talk about for a living. So thank you for that. Thank you for giving us some time today, Shane.
Oh no, man, I'm super excited about this.
Yeah, you've been mentioning it, that you've been looking forward to it, and we've been looking forward to it as well. So let's dive in. Give us a little bit of personal background first. Tell us about yourself and what you do.
So my name is Shane McInnis. I am a college history instructor. I teach at a junior college here in Mississippi where I live. I have previously taught high school and university level college history classes before. As soon as I graduated, I did high school history for about 6 years, and then started working on my master's, and then switches over to doing adjunct work, just kind of as I could pick up classes. And that lasted for probably 3 or 4 years before I picked up the full-time history gig that I have now. I have undergraduate studies in history and religion. My master's is in Ancient Imperial History, which I know is like a super niche little market, but that's what it is. And I'm currently working on another master's in sociology, which I'm going to finish up over the summer. So that's me.
The larger share of our audience are artists that are either, in fantasy or sci-fi, or they're artists that are, interested in some level of fantasy and sci-fi.
Yeah.
And that brings us, I think, to a good opening for, the connection to art, in that as fantasy artists or fans of fantasy art, Tolkien is the cornerstone
right.
of all of this. And I think that it would be interesting and fun to open talking about Tolkien and how all of his stories relate to histories. Oh my God, did I just do that? That was totally unintentional. I swear.
Oh yeah, man, absolutely.
Swear to God. So yeah, so I mean, Tolkien is, I think, for many reasons, some of which I just mentioned, Tolkien is a great example, of the connection between life and art. Because as he inspires so many of us, he was inspired by real life events.
Right.
Well, can you give us a quick rundown of like where the godfather of fantasy got his historical inspirations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start off by saying that I am not uh, what a lot of people would call an official Tolkien scholar. There are people that spend, and I'm not joking, their entire lives studying Tolkien stuff. I'm just a giant nerd that's read Lord of the Rings every summer since I was like 9, um, and I really appreciate the stuff that he's done. So yes, Tolkien as an individual grew up at a really important period of time in history. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a really big changing period of time. The old imperial system was still moving around, so you still have these big French and British and even American empires that are dominating politics across the globe. Of course, you have the Industrial Revolution, sort of second wave of the Industrial Revolution, where people are getting pushed out of jobs, and there are lots of big social problems because of unemployment. And you see the rise of new political ideologies, things like fascism, communism, all of that starting to kind of bubble up as a result um, of the second kind of wave of the Industrial Revolution. You have automation. One of his big things that he sort of talked about a lot in his personal letters was how fast things were changing. And like Tolkien never liked riding in cars. Even as a very old guy, he still rode bikes everywhere if he could. Um, he, of course, fought in World War One. He was at the Battle of the Somme, which was a really rough period in the world in the war. He was alive during World War II. He had a lot of opinions on people like Hitler and Mussolini. He had a lot of ideas about Nazism. Not he was supporting Nazism. He wrote a lot against that. He, of course, witnessed nuclear weapons being dropped and did not care for that either. He didn't really like this idea of taking all of the stuff that we had and weaponizing science. Uh, he was a witness to a lot of the things that were happening in England around that time, where after World War II they were giving up their empire, and uh, he had a lot of ideas about economics and politics. So that period of time, if we're looking at the late 1800s and early 1900s, that was just a really active period of time anyway, and he just happened to live right in the middle of that. So that's kind of the backdrop of where he pulls a lot of his ideas from.
Uh,
How does that turn in? How does all that empire stuff turn into in World War II and World War One turn into elves and dwarves and a dragon named Smaug?
So that is actually not the direct source of that. So Tolkien's source material was not necessarily the events themselves, but the stuff that he read. And what ended up happening was that he had this interest in stuff like ancient writings, things that we would know, Beowulf, the Viking sagas. There's a sort of a big Viking story called the Kalevala. He was a big reader of things like, we've lost Moose.
it happens every now and just ignore it.
So he read a lot of medieval stuff as well, things like Chaucer, some of the Arthurian legends, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Song of Roland, that kind of stuff. And he was interested in that. And when he started writing, that was sort of the thing he was trying to emulate. And then all of the stuff that happened in the world around him just sort of added flavor to his love of historical writing styles. Because above all, he was a linguist. He learned Latin while he was at home. His parents taught him Latin when he was really, really young. He learned Esperanto, which is a language that a lot of people don't even know about. He made up languages with his cousins and friends when they were little, and he studied languages really, really extensively, even from a very young age. So, he had this knowledge of Anglo-Saxon and Middle English and could translate all of this stuff from the original languages, and that really tied him into the whole the whole ancient world in a way. And one of the things that he was really trying to do is provide something that he didn't really think England had. So if you look at a lot of the other cultures around the late 1800s, one of the things that's happening sort of as a larger macro movement is that a lot of countries were trying to find their identities. There's a lot of ethnic tension going on. These big empires are dominating other small groups. So you have the Austro-Hungarian Empire that basically controls half of the Balkan Peninsula. But what about all of these other people that have their own identities, Serbians, Croatians, etc.? What about all the people in India that are being controlled by the British? And so you have this movement towards cultural identities, and this brought countries together like Germany and Italy that are actually really new. They didn't really even unify until the 1870s. But all of these cultures started looking for their collective history. So like you have these things like the Brothers Grimm, which were written as a collection of German folk stories to sort of help create this German identity. But Tolkien didn't find that in England. There wasn't really a folklore or this unifying theme for England. The Irish had some in the Celtic stories, the French had some, the Germans had some, but there wasn't really anything that fit that very well for England. And he thought maybe he could be the one that would be able to fill this gap. Maybe he could write something that would be on the same level as that and serve the same purpose as that. And what he ended up doing was falling into the fantasy genre instead of the folklore genre. So,
and he didn't want to wait until Harry Potter or Song of Ice and Fire was released.
Right. You don't have to wait for the international success, and that's one of the things that that I think is so great about Tolkien. He really didn't ever expect to get popular. He didn't think that this was something that was going to get him there, and he even resisted it. So he wrote The Hobbit, and it was published in 1937, and it wasn't until almost 20 years later that Lord of the Rings came out. And Hobbit came out, and people were like, "Hey, where's the rest of this? Where's more stuff going on in this world?" And he's like, that was just kind of a story, that I wrote kind of for my kids, and I really don't know." And so he started it, and he wrote some, and then it sat for like a decade, and he basically didn't write much of anything on it. And his editors at the publishing house were like, "Go back and finish writing this stuff. This is going to print us money." And he's like,
And that goes to show, like work on your passion projects. Don't neglect those.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm vaguely aware that Tolkien was always pretty insistent that his stories should not be taken as allegories.
Right.
And and then there's like some, debate there whether, we should or shouldn't, and that's for another time. But I'm wondering, this is more of like an art philosophy question than strictly a history question. But as a historian, I think that you could maybe lend some interesting insight to this. It raises the question for me of, to what degree an artist owns the impression that other people have of their art. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a question that we have to ask ourselves as historians and just as people a lot. You can look at a source, and before I go too much further, I'm not trying to imply some sort of existentialist approach to interpreting sources by any means. But one of the things that we have to do when we look at a document in history is not just look at what it says, but look at who wrote it, when it was written, whether or not there was a specific purpose that it was being written. So we can get into this debate about whether or not something is stated or something was implied. And, when it comes to art and writing, there's a certain point where it's yours as an artist or as a writer or as a creative individual. But once you let it out into the world, you're sort of allowing everyone else to have a free go at it. If you don't want other people to have some sort of, reaction to your art, if it's a truly personal thing, don't let it out there. But when you put it out into the world, you are asking for others' approval, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe that's not the best way of saying it. You are allowing for other people to interpret your work, and you can go out into the world and tell people what you meant for it to be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be that for them. I look at a painting and I see one thing, and one thing stands out to me. And Moose and Joby look at the same painting and they see something else that stands out to them. We're still looking at the same painting, right? And what we see as an individual might not be what the artist was intending us to look at, you know. So, and I think that's why art itself speaks to so many people. It's that we bring into this relationship with the artist our own histories, our own biases, the results of who we are based on our choices and those choices of those around us. And when you look at a piece of art or consume a piece of art, you're forming a relationship with somebody through time and space. And all you can do is hope that it means something to them.
So
But
on that note,
yeah.
The Hobbit, you said, was the hit, and
Mhm.
it went well before the Lord of the Rings came out. And of course, that had the lead up to it. But what was it that has there been any research as to what about the Hobbit could be, taken apart and used as a reference to people, like the guide to how to make a book that people care about or art that people care about?
Well, it was almost one of those things that was sort of a perfect storm. So the fantasy genre itself is not very old. It really only comes from like the middle of the 1800s, and it really didn't even get popular until the late 1800s and early 1900s, uh, with people like George McDonald and Eric Erikson. But the Hobbit hit right at a period of time where there was a lot of very heavy and prevalent good versus evil, because this is us leading up to Nazi Germany and World War II. The bad guys in the story are very evidently the bad guys, and the good guys are pretty clearly analogous to the British people or the common people. The plight of the regular guy that gets caught up in these big grand scheme of things. That's what a lot of people were feeling like. The average person was still very aware of World War One, and 10 million people died in World War One. It was the largest war that the world had ever seen at that point. Europe was in tatters. The population of England didn't get back to the pre World War One levels until like the 1980s. Uh, so there's still a lot of very real little guy gets to win, which is a great thing. The big bad guy is the greedy thing that hoards all of the wealth. We're in the middle of the greatest depression economically that the world had ever seen. So the notes that the Hobbit hit were perfect for that time, but the way that Tolkien wrote was such that the stories that he told were open and applicable to basically anybody. Who has ever felt like they are Bilbo Baggins standing in the presence of a dragon? Everybody's felt that overwhelming enemy, that presence that's going to devour you, and we all hope that we can find something that gets us out of that situation. So Tolkien's telling stories that he knows apply to everybody across the board, but that ties back into his history as an analyst of ancient documents, because the stories that we tell each other, they can have nuance, and they can have different set dressings, and they can be told in varying degrees of skill. But a lot of the stories that we tell each other are a lot of the same things, just over and over, because regardless of when you live or where you live, humans are humans. If you find a human from 220,000 years ago in Africa, they want the same thing that we want. They want safety when they go to sleep at night. They want to be able to feed their family. They want to not have to fear every day that they're alive. And this concept that I think a lot of people miss in history, we have this tendency sometimes to look back and find these figures, and we sort of interact with them only as kind of abstract concepts. Like, we talk about George Washington, and he's this pillar of our history, and we know all these stories about him, but he was a guy. He had bad days. He woke up as president sometime and went, I don't really want to do this. He got sick. You know he goofed off and had fun with his friends when he should have been doing stuff that was more serious. But that's true of everybody in history, right? Human beings are human beings. It doesn't matter when we are. We just have different toys and, fancier stuff.
So if I'm going to oversimplify your answer, it was high quality content, it was relatable, and it was in regard to a popular phenomenon that was going on in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
That's the too long didn't read version.
The TLDR. But the interesting thing, though, is that Tolkien didn't have that as an intent going into it. So it was, oh man, it's hard to know if there's like, if part of the key to the success of a story is not intending for it to be a success, and just like,
yeah, there's definitely a roll of the dice thing about any time you let something out.
Yeah, so, but it does make me wonder, though, if we can sort of finesse it a little bit, and we're not going to be able to game the system necessarily when we're talking about human consciousness as a general idea. But you're talking about the sort of the things that were happening in Tolkien's times and like these big historical moments, and how that relates to us as individuals, because we all feel these similarities. So is there a for an artist that maybe might want to get more familiarity with kind of like what those larger underlying patterns are, is there a school of history or a school of study that one could look at and learn from that does deal with those archetypes?
There's a little bit in a lot of different fields. So if you're looking at just what makes humans humans, it's anthropology. If you're looking at what makes humans form societies, that's sociology. And if you're looking at how we've messed around since we started, that's in history. But if there's not a specific discipline, I don't think, that would basically teach you how to, well, I don't know, maybe if you got a degree in something like literary criticism or source criticism, but that stuff is hard to find good schools in, and
school's expensive.
Yeah, school's expensive, and there aren't many places that offer really heavy degrees in stuff like source criticism, and that's not going to be something you're going to go be able to do, as a bachelor's degree. That's going to be something that you're maybe not even going to get into until you get to like the doctoral level.
What about some more casual ways to find this information, whether it be like YouTube channels or books? What would you recommend that artists can look into without spending $100,000?
Honestly, you can find a lot of this stuff just online. This is the world as we know it has changed in such a way that there are so many things available for free. You can go find translations of all of these ancient documents. You can find critiques on them that have been published. People have, especially in the history world, people have started doing a lot of stuff that's really good scholarly work that they've been releasing sort of on their own. There is a lot of gatekeeping that gets done when it comes to getting published in history journals and things like that. So a lot of people that are out there have just resorted to sort of doing kind of what I do on Twitch, which is just bringing history to people directly. So people like Extra History or Crash Course, things like that, offer really good introductions to a lot of this stuff. There are some free courses that you can get into at places like Khan Academy, that offers kind of overview of topics. Those are of varying levels of quality. A lot of people want you to pay for their stuff up front, which I can totally respect. I'm not trying to denigrate that at all. But if you're really just trying to get into how do we know what we know and how do we approach these topics, I don't want to say that it's not something that everybody can do, because I do believe that it is. But to get good at it takes some real dedication. It's not just necessarily something that is kind of an armchair passion, unless you're really going to be with it for the rest of your life. And I know that sounds really exactly like the kind of people that I was talking against at the beginning, saying like, no, this is my field and you can't walk in here and just do this off the street. Uh, and that's not what I mean at all. I do think that everybody can appreciate history and everybody can appreciate sociology and anthropology and stuff like that. But to figure out what's good and to figure out what's valid and what's provable is a bit of a developed skill.
Yeah, I don't think most of our viewers or listeners are going to try to get a career in history so much as they are to use that information that they do find, whether it's valid or invalid, to inspire their works.
Well, I mean, I tell my students all the time, go to Wikipedia. I go to Wikipedia all the time. The idea that Wikipedia is a joke is not really a joke anymore. It's one of the most highly edited websites that's out there. Now, there's a lot of opinion on it. And if you just look at Wikipedia and that's as far as you go, you might end up with some biased information. But hey, it's a great place to start. One of the things that I tell my students to do all the time if they're looking for sources for a paper is go see what Wikipedia cites. Go see what, roll down to the bottom, look at the footnotes, see what they cited, and then go find that book. Or, if it's an ancient document, Google that guy. In most of the big sources from the ancient world are translated in English. You can find them online. Stuff that I used for my thesis is now completely for free online.
Yeah, I think, I have in mind, more the tools for breaking artist block and writer's block and things like that. Kind of becoming an armchair historian or listening to, anthropological, sociological, historical podcasts, and YouTube channels and stuff. That sounds like, from what you're saying, it sounds like those are good places to sort of like have going as like background radiation, while you're working as an artist, because it sounds like a great place to fill the idea bank,
absolutely.
And looking for inspiration and reference. Yeah,
totally. There's so much stuff out there. Everybody that's ever existed has a culture, and we know a lot more about it now than we used to. And there's so much stuff to just go hang out with. And I'm probably, and this is going to sound weird, but because I do a lot of my own research, I'm probably not so great when it comes to sort of the what's out there in the general sense kind of thing. And I know that's weird and makes me sound very stodgy, but I mean, I don't spend a lot of time crawling around for history podcasts, because I basically, if I want to do something, I go grab a book off the shelf, which sounds weird, but history is work sometimes, and when I do that all day, sometimes I don't want to spend all afternoon listening to a history podcast. I want to go play a video game or watch Joby draw something.
Fair enough. That makes total sense. I mean, whatever you spend doing all day, that's not what you want to do necessarily in your free time, unless you're me, and then you are weird. But with this idea in mind, of art, writing, music for that matter, the ones that like hit big at the times that they do, really nailing the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Zeitgeist.
So here's a trick for German. If you have an E and an I together, you don't say the first one, you say the second one as a long one.
I'm going to come back and listen to this podcast again just for that. I couldn't keep track of that while you were saying it, but I like it. So when we're thinking of archetypes and, and like big picture systems, there's probably like nothing bigger than religion and politics.
Right.
And it seems, from my point of view, that religion and politics have probably had like the biggest influences on art of like anything. Does to your mind, is like anything even come close as those two? Is there anything else out of that? It's like death and taxes.
Not really. And to be completely fair, if you look at, and this is going to get real kind of deep in the weeds here and very big picture-y kind of stuff.
Yes.
But if you look at human society, when we figure out how to grow food and we can stop being hunter-gatherers, the first two things that show up are religion and politics. And, you know, I will say, though, what we have to remember is that even though religion and politics show up first after we settle down in cities, we had art and music and language for hundreds of thousands of years.
Certainly.
Before that, because art and music and language are what make us people. That this is the way that we communicate with each other. This is the way that we pass down our knowledge. This is the way that we try to explain how we feel on the inside to other people and make connections with them. But yeah. So if you look at art prior to that, it's fairly primitive. You have your cave paintings and you have your hand outlines and you have some statues and things of that nature. But when you start getting into the civilized world where you can specialize in something, where everybody doesn't have to farm, where you hit that point where you make more food than you need, and people can specialize, the first two things that really take off are art and politics. The biggest guy starts saying, I don't have to farm anymore because I'm going to beat everybody else up in the village. So I'm now the chief. And the old person that understands a little bit more science goes, well, guess what? So I'm now the conduit with the gods and I don't have to work either. And there's actually a lot of debate in the history world about which one of those came first, the religion or the history. I'm sorry, the religion or the politics. I'm a pretty big fan of the concept that religion came way before that.
Yeah, that would make sense.
That's a whole other esoteric world of arguing, and we have to do a lot of speculation and stuff.
And also a lot of like definitions of like what constitutes a religion and what constitutes politics, because both could have been around in
certainly
in various forms.
But we get the first writing based around religious stuff. The earliest writing systems that we have in the ancient world, Sumerian, cuneiform, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. That stuff starts in the temples. The first written narrative of anything that we have is a hymn to one of the gods in Sumer from like 3500 BC. So when you get to the point where you're specializing, you also want to decorate your stuff, which is where your art comes in, and you start getting patrons from either the religion or the government that are going to pay you to decorate themselves, decorate the palaces that they live in. One of the one of the greatest examples of this, I think, is ancient Assyria. When the Assyrians came out really big in the Iron Age and were beating everybody else up, the emperors started carrying around artists with them when they went on war campaigns. And they would get the artists to kind of sit out on a hill while they were ransacking this city and just draw what they saw. And you go back to these palaces in the capital cities and you walk down this long hallway to get to the emperor. So you walk in this front door and you have to walk through this imaginarium where all of the walls on both sides of this gigantic hallway are just full of these pictures from Tiglath-Pileser wrecking this city. Here's him after he killed all these people and piled their heads up. So he's sitting on a giant pile of skulls. Here's him flaying everybody alive. And these were court artists that were tasked with drawing this stuff. Like, hey, draw a picture of me knocking down the walls of this city with my giant battering ram. So you have sponsorships of art. And I know that's a very kind of brutal way to look at art, but I mean, it's all propaganda and stuff. But, we have art and politics and religion in this same little circle going all the way back to the beginning.
Well, oh shit, I just lost my train of thought.
That's cool.
Well, religion and politics having such a big influence. And, if we can, I think, agree that there isn't necessarily anything new under the sun, all art is derivative. Would we then be able to say that all of our inspiration in one way or the other can all be traced back up to religion and politics?
I say that art comes from the human condition. You know, there are pieces of all of us, regardless of whether or not we're introverts or extroverts, that need connection with other people. And I think that's one thing that has become really evident over the last year and a half or so, um, with people not being able to get in contact with each other and having to, stay in lockdowns and stuff. But one of the ways that we try to get in touch with other people is art and being creative. We have these ideas that are inside of us, and we want to get them out into the world so that other people can identify. We create these societies of ideas, uh, you know, and it just so happens that two of the biggest things in who we are what we believe in, what we believe politically and what we believe religiously. That's a lot of our identity. So, we're clearly going to relate to people based on our similarities and our differences, but how we get that stuff out is through our creative process, right? So everybody is capable of creating. It doesn't matter if it's something that is going to be consumed by somebody else, but we all started off drawing. Every little kid gets the crayons, right, and does the scribbles. And you know, I always point out when I'm talking to people, especially when I'm talking to my students, is that if you give a kid a crayon, they're going to draw before they write letters. You know, they're going to draw scribbles or pictures, or they're going to, start trying to do stick figures or the sun up in the corner of the piece of paper. They're going to try to get what they experience out on paper before they figure out that I can draw certain squiggles that relate to the words that I'm saying. So there's a condition with all of us to get what we have inside outside and let other people experience that. So yeah, politics and religion both play into art, and yeah, everything kind of can go back to that, but it's not because politics and religion are like that. It's just because we all encounter that same sort of stuff. Yeah.
No, I have this perhaps naive delusion that I can somehow break out of that. Like I can get rid of all the influences, cultural influences, and make something pure, man. But actually,
yeah, then you have to just be Stephen Pollock and go into the Gestalt.
Oh yeah,
durable painting stuff.
Right. So I remembered what I was going to say when you were talking before, about the rise of religion. The first thing that happened after agriculture was the domination of religion and politics. But there's been art, well before that. It's not like religion and politics invented art. But one thing that I've always thought of that was interesting is that, for the 200,000 some odd years that humans were around and making art, it wasn't until you can correct me if this is actually inaccurate. My understanding is that it wasn't until the Renaissance that we actually started figuring out things like perspective, or I shouldn't say figuring out, getting interested in things like perspective, like strict human proportion, things like, I don't even know like what the group of technicalities that you would call that, but do you have a sense of like why that is or what precipitated that?
Well, I would say that it's not necessarily the first time that humans have done that. It was just the best times that humans had done that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go back and look at ancient art, the concept of proportion and shadow and lighting, stuff like that, had been done before, but mostly by cultures that had evaporated hundreds and hundreds of years before the Renaissance, right? So if you look at art in Europe, after Rome falls, Rome collapses in 476 in the West. All of the big countries were run by people that did not have high-level specialized artists, and that started becoming a thing again in the medieval period. But they were basically starting from scratch again. You know, uh, They also didn't know how to build arches. They couldn't build really big ceilings anymore because they had lost all the knowledge that Rome had. Because you have to remember that when Rome collapses, you have all these barbarian tribes like the Vandals and the Goths and all these different people that who did not have native skilled artisans like the Romans did. Rome was allowed to have that because they had this high level of specialization and trade and stable governments and things like that that allow people to do it. But if you go and look over in places like China and India and Japan, they didn't really have that same interruption. You know, cultures in China have endured more or less in the same kind of longer arc since the 2500s BC. So when Europe gets into this stuff, they're not necessarily reinventing the wheel per se. What they're doing is they're finally figuring out that there are other influences out there and trying to go and find those. And then when they figure that stuff out, then they decide to try to do it better. And they are also doing that in the same sort of movement with this larger concept of how to understand the world, right? So we have this scientific inquiry that starts, and we're trying to formalize all of our concepts into ways that can be explained and valued and ranked and ordered and measured. So you figure out how to do light, and then you figure out how to do proportion. And the stuff that they're doing though is based on a lot of older stuff. So if you look at a Greek sculpture from one of the big high Greek periods of time in the maybe the 400s or something BC, that was done with an incredible level of realism. These people in the Greek world got in trouble for digging up bodies and stuff and measuring stuff just like the people in the Renaissance did. But they had that knowledge and it was lost in the West for so long that it sort of became, I don't know, almost a fairy tale. So the Renaissance itself was not building from scratch. It was recovering what had been lost and then making it better.
Okay, that makes sense. And I misspoke earlier. Well, I was referring to proportion and perspective, and then I said something to the effect of like, well, I wouldn't know what to call that category of technicalities, and I was trying to intentionally avoid using the word fundamentals, and that's what they are, but that just seems like super Eurocentric to be like, well, the Renaissance figured out fundamentals,
Well, a lot of that stuff was still going on too, and you have to remember that the reason the Renaissance even started was that all of these European people from the West started traveling over to Asia and traveling over to places like the Holy Land that they went to in the Crusades. They went to some of these people from France and Spain and Italy end up in Constantinople to go help out the Byzantines in the Crusade. And they're just completely blown away. They're like, holy crud, how did you guys build all this stuff? And they're like, man, that's a dinky building. You should see this one over here. And they go see Hagia Sophia, which was the largest enclosed building for like 2,000 years. And they're like, holy crud, what's up with this stuff? And they're like, man, you can't build a dome? And they're like, man, we haven't built a dome in 300 years. So then they start bringing all of this stuff over, and they run into Arabic math, and they run into Islamic art, and they run into the old Greek and Roman stuff that people in the Byzantine Empire had never lost. And then they realized how far behind they were. And one of the reasons the Renaissance hit so hard was they realized how far behind they were, and then they decided to throw their money behind it. So it's like, we need to catch up. We're behind. And we need to be cool like those people are. And how can we be cooler than those people are? And a lot of the Renaissance, and this is going to sound rude to the people in the past, but they're dead. A lot of the Renaissance was driven by rich people wanting to have things to show off. The Medici family.
Say it isn't so.
I know, it's crazy. People like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti and Bernini and anybody named after, or anybody that a Ninja Turtle is named after. All those people were funded by super rich people that wanted to show stuff off. But to do that, they had to be able to pay people to learn all of that stuff and then perfect it. And that took a lot of time. And the interest wasn't there during most of the medieval period because the political situation wasn't stable. For art and stuff like that to flourish, you have to have a peace that exists that allows things to happen. In the ancient world, you didn't get to do art if you were worried about where your next meal came from. The support system that we have today in our world, even for people, and this is going to sound rough, and I don't mean it to sound rough, but even for people that are what we might call today starving artists, they have it today a lot easier than the people in the ancient world did. We do not know how many people that were just as smart as Leonardo da Vinci that died on a farm in France because they never left more than 30 miles from their home. And just like today, we don't know how many talented artists there are out there because they live in impoverished areas, but we know more of them exist now because we have things like the internet. We have technology that gets your stuff out there. And you can be an artist living in Cambodia and selling your art to people in New York on the internet now. And our world today has offered so much more to people that just did not exist back then. And when you're at a constant state of war, when your country is, fighting these 100 years long wars against themselves, the number of people that have the opportunity to sit down and do art is really low. So when the rich people figured out we need to make art a thing, then it became a thing. And I know that sounds super classist, but that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is what it is. But I mean, that's a perfect place to, get on a soapbox for a moment, and go back to talking about the democratization of everything. You're talking about somebody living in Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia. Sell your stuff to, people that live in the developed worlds,
and sell it to them for what the people in the developed worlds are selling it for.
Thank you. Okay. So stepping back off.
Art has a value.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter where you're making it. It has a value on the internet, just like you're making it in New York City or LA or Washington or Mississippi.
Listen, a fucking historian said it. Okay, people? This is somebody that does this for a living. Now you can't argue with me anymore. But
I'm tempted to ask if like Leonardo da Vinci was undercutting his peer by 10%, but I don't want to get into that. So we just leave it as a joke.
Leonardo da Vinci was notorious for not finishing stuff. He would take money from people and start stuff and then get really bored with it and want to do something else. And they would have to hound him like crazy to finish things. There are about 6 or 7 of his really, really famous paintings that are beautiful at the top, just absolutely stunning, and then pencil at the bottom. Because he started and he was just like, I don't really feel like painting St. Jerome anymore. That's enough.
I do want to circle back around to Tolkien, just for the sake of asking and getting into the next series of questions. Currently, I feel like in the West at least, fantasy, the idea of like fantasy art, and then to the degree that sci-fi is influenced by fantasy, which I think that it is, not to start that flame war, but it all kind of defaults to Tolkien. He, like I said, he's the godfather, right. or Tolkien derivative settings. And we're just talking about medieval Europe. Before Tolkien, was medieval Europe like the default setting for fantasy work, fantasy art, or books and stuff?
Yeah. So and I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that we have to kind of remember in scope is that fantasy didn't really exist until the sort of mid 1800s as a genre. Before that,
it was just fiction.
Well, you had mythology and you had folklore and you had fairy tales, and there are nuances between all of those that I would love to get into if you would like me to. But let me answer this question and then we can circle back to that.
Sure.
So the people that started the fantasy genre were almost all people that had this sort of classical studying history. And when I say classical, I mean here that they were studying the Greek and the Latin, and they had knowledge of languages and things of the past, which was sort of a growing cultural thing because, again, there's just larger interest in your cultural background. This is when the world is developing concepts like nationalism and cultural identities. So this was sort of a vogue concept at that time. So you have people like George McDonald. Now, George McDonald is a guy from the UK. He is considered the first actual writer um, of fantasy. He wrote in the mid 1800s. There's a book of his called Fantasties. It's spelled with a PH and two T's in it for some reason. Um, and he was this kind of guy. He was uh, a linguist. He was a scholar. He had a lot of studying stuff. He actually had gone to college for things like chemistry and physics, and ended up going and being a preacher for a while. And he just didn't like that, so he sort of wrote on the side. But because his interests were in these things like ancient and medieval writings, when he started writing his fantasy stuff, he tried to mimic that on the same themes and concepts that were in those other writings. So he had read the King Arthur stuff, and he had read all of the Knight's Tale stuff and the the romances like Don Quixote and Songs of Roland and things of that nature, which were all set in that kind of high medieval world. And that was a really big influence. And so then you have people like um, Eric Edison, who started writing in the late 1800s, published a book in 1925 called The Worm Ouroboros, which was sort of the first really kind of popular fantasy book that got around into a lot of the big echelon circles of writing. He was actually kind of friends with Tolkien. They were in the same little writing group called the Inklings. So he was a similar kind of guy. These people are ones that studied European uh, histories. They had read the sagas of the Vikings, and they had read the fairy tales of like the Ulster cycle of Celtic mythology and things like that. So they had that repository of myth and folklore and fairy tale. And when they started doing their own writing, the key shift here, the difference between fantasy and other genres, and I'll kind of loop this into the previous question, or the rabbit hole here. The difference between fantasy and myth and fantasy and folklore is that fantasy is set in a completely made up world. So a myth is a story that people created over a long period of time and as a group, so as a culture or as a civilization or as a society, a group of people tried to explain something in the natural world, maybe that they didn't understand, maybe that they didn't know where it came from. So we try to explain why um, an eclipse happens. And so we have the story that the sun is a god and the moon is a god and the sun is chasing the moon. And sometimes they get really close to each other and catch each other. And that's a myth, right? So it's set in our world, but it explains something that we don't understand. And folklore is something that's set in our culture that explains why we are like we are, that has a specific tie into who we are as an individual. So, we have folklore in America. We have people like John Henry, who was the steel driving man, who fought against the automated steam trail and beat it, but then he blew up. His heart burst. But that's a folklore and a legend of our culture, and that explains that we are hardworking people, and there were people working themselves to death at that time to try to beat automation, and they worked really hard, and they might have been better, but they couldn't beat it overall. Uh, and then you have fantasy, which is written by one person for a specific reason, that is set in a world that is not ours, that has its own rules, and with the knowledge that it's not real. So when people do stuff like myths, they were explaining things that are weird and fanciful and have elements that we might call, fantasy elements. But the people were trying to explain something that they thought really might have happened. When we talk about any of the big cultures that have creation myths, they thought that's really how the world got here. And there might have been some people that didn't believe it 100%, the people that were like, oh, I don't really think the world came about that way. But there were people that were basing their knowledge on this story. And that's why you get a lot of people that get real close to this stuff. Um, One of the most angry that I've ever seen some people. I was at a um, I was at a symposium where there were some people talking, and I live again in southern Mississippi. It's a very Christian conservative area, and one of the primary speakers started talking about Christian mythology, and that triggered a whole bunch of people in the audience because they were like, "What do you mean mythology? This is stuff that really happened." Uh, and this is the way that ancient people would have felt if you called their stories mythology. Like if you walked up to a Japanese guy and said, hey, that story about Susanoo and Amaterasu, that didn't really happen, that was just all made up, that would potentially really offend them. But that if you walked up to Tolkien and said, hey man, Lord of the Rings, that really didn't happen, he'd be like, yeah, I know.
Okay.
So there's a difference in the fantasy genre that's not the exact same as folklore and mythology and stuff like that.
So going back to Tolkien, because you just brought him up,
Yeah.
he did a whole backstory thing that he intended not to be published. The
Right.
Silmarillion.
Silmarillion.
Yeah, that thing.
All right.
So he was basically creating his own. At that point, it was his own version of a mythology,
Right.
that the people of that planet, of that setting, would believe was the truth.
Correct.
Okay. So would it be worthwhile or too much work to do that when someone was considering creating their own fantasy novel or fantasy setting?
Yeah. So if you're trying to set up something that's going to be Tolkien-esque, or if you're trying to accomplish something like that, there are big benefits and there are big pitfalls. And I don't talk about this a whole lot, but I am an author. I have published several things, fictional stories. They're all historical fiction, and several short stories, novels. Anyway, that's a whole other world that I don't really talk about too terribly much. So I do have a little bit of credibility talking about writing here and world building. But the biggest thing about world building that Tolkien would tell you is just to be genuine. World building it's a task. It's not something that really happens just by a coincidence. And details are important, but you don't have to have the entire thing decided beforehand. So if we're talking about Tolkien, the first thing that he actually wrote set in what he called Middle Earth was this bit of poetry that went on to be part of the Silmarillion. And he wrote that when he was recovering from trench fever when he got called back from World War One. He got called back. He was a lieutenant. He was at the Somme, and he got really sick and got called back and was put on basically a desk rotation until he got better, but he never really got better. It took him a couple of years to kind of recover completely. So they basically put him under medical discharge. He was still part of the military, but he wasn't ever going to get to go back to the front line. And in the meantime, a lot of his friends were out there dying. And so he started working on this stuff to try to work through some of these feelings. I suspect this is me kind of shooting back a little bit as to interpreting Tolkien, but he started writing stuff way different than the Lord of the Rings. So this first stories that he wrote was actually part of the Silmarillion called the Fall of Gondolin. And he wrote another little story that was part of this larger thing called the Lay of Luthien and Beren. And then he wrote another kind of story called the Children of Hurin, or the story of Turin Tarambar. But none of that is The Hobbit, and none of that is Lord of the Rings. So he was world building even back then, but he didn't have all of it filled in, right? So he did not have every single blank filled in. And if you are trying to do world building and you're going at it from the position of, I have to have every single blank filled in ahead of time, you're never going to start writing, right? You're never going to start drawing. If you decide, well, I have to create a series of pictures, and I want these pictures to be based in this fanciful setting, and I want to have a certain theme through all of them, and I'm going to develop different races for all of these people. But then, what do those people wear? What do those people live in? How do those people communicate? Where do they stay in this city, or do they stay in that city? And you can do that forever, but you have to start, and you have to get something out, right? And Tolkien himself was notorious for writing stuff and then going, I don't really like that. And he would revise it or completely delete it or edit it or move it around in his timeline. So even as he was writing stuff, he didn't have it all nailed down, right? So you need to know enough about what's going on to make it convincing, but you also don't have to paint everything so clearly that you end up in a corner and can't move around, So that's what I would say to that.
That's encouraging. It says to me that there's still time for any of us to become the next Tolkien.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and he didn't publish a really big book like that until, so he started writing stuff like that in like 1919, and The Hobbit didn't get published until 1937, so that's almost 20 years later.
So now today, the relationship between, before I go there, I wanted to just make sure that we did go down that rabbit hole that you were excited about. Was that you were kind of like explaining the difference between like myth and fantasy and stuff?
That's what I was talking about, the differences between the genres.
Yeah. Cool. Just wanted to make
sure. I mean,
if
you want to circle back to that and had any questions, I can ramble about that forever, man.
I would love to talk to you about that for the next hour, but we still have a few other questions. So
I told you guys before we got started that you're going to have to cut me off eventually.
I have a couple of like kind of super nerd questions though.
Oh yeah, go for it. These are my kind of topics.
I've always kind
I'm the guy you bring with you to bar trivia.
Well, this is just purely self-indulgent because I've always wondered, like, where do like the big fantasy elements come from? Like where do we get even just the idea of a dragon or a wizard? Yeah. Where does that stuff come from?
So dragons actually have this really interesting historical overarch, because they start off the emphasis, or I guess I shouldn't say the emphasis, the inspiration for dragons comes from serpents, right? And even in a lot of ancient documents, if you read the mythology, you hear them referred to as serpents, and they're really big serpents. But in the ancient world, you have this concept that, snakes and serpents are wise. They represent a change in growth because they shed their skin. They have all sorts of knowledge, So if you look at the earliest story that we have, that's a kind of a narrative beginning to an end story, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. At the very end of the story, Gilgamesh is denied his goal because a serpent steals his magic plant that's going to give him immortality. And of course, you have the serpent in the Garden of Eden. You have all these things that show up, and over time, that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it has a lot of influence on Greek mythology and Roman mythology. But there's also, and this might seem kind of weird, but ancient people found dinosaur bones. They kill a lizard and they look at the skull and go, hey, that looks like this. And then they find, a dinosaur bone and go, what is that? Oh, that must have been a lot bigger lizard or a much bigger animal that did this thing, So that's part of it as well. But what we know as a modern dragon, with fire breathing and wings and flying and stuff like that, that brings in a lot of Asian influence as well. Asian dragons are the ones with the big honking legs and arms that fly around and, basically look like Falkor from the Neverending Story. So what we know of is a blend of ancient Mesopotamian and Greek and Indus culture, and Roman stuff and Asian stuff all mixed together to get the idea of a dragon that we would recognize as, the big flappy thing with Smaug kind of characteristics that Steve Najarian or Justin Gerard might draw. But wizards come from ancient people that knew science. So we talked about those people that were in your group that understood how to heal you, and for most of what we know as Western culture, and for most of the culture of the world, science and magic are basically the same thing. So you have certain people that understand that the natural world provides certain things, and they hold on to this knowledge, and they're able to do things that other people can't. And because ailments and sickness in the ancient world were so much to do with the emphasis of evil spirits on your body or the spiritual world attacking you, the guy that could get rid of the ailment is not only providing you relief, but is also has some sort of power over the natural world. And this is kind of a joke that you see pop up in movies like, like the Thor movie, where they're like, oh yeah, this is just science is just magic that you understand. But wizards are the people that, are kind of possessors of this secret stuff. If you look at wizards and Tolkien, they are actually sent by the gods to Middle Earth with secret knowledge to help people and heal the hurts of the land and stuff like that. So that idea that they are somehow tied to power that normal people can't get to really just reflects that knowledge is power kind of thing. And if I can, and just think about it this way. So if you went back in time with your cell phone, right? You had your cell phone, and let's just, for this particular moment, imagine that your phone could use the internet even back in the ancient time, right? So hypothetically speaking, and you go back and you sit down with an ancient person, and they start asking you stuff like, man, I wonder why my tooth hurts. So you look in their mouth with their flashlight, and then you get on the internet and you Google dentistry manuals, and then you perform some very basic, dental surgery on this person. And then you go over here to this tree, and you know that this tree's bark makes pain go away. They would look at you like you're a wizard, right? They would go like, how do you know all of this wisdom? Where did you get all of this stuff? And you hold your cell phone up and you go, this is my magic tablet. All of the knowledge of the world is contained within. And then someone would kill you and take your tablet from you. But that's just what happens. But if you're talking about orcs, orcs are the dark side of human nature. Everybody has this part of them that's hard to control. Orcs look like us. They can talk like us. They can think like us, but they're controlled and they're driven by their base nature, right? So you have this duality of, I can control myself, but deep within me, there's something that I can't control. And that's what an orc is. So, so the orcs are inside of all of us.
So, just quick tangent on orcs.
Yeah.
In the Tolkien universe, Middle Earth, orcs were like corrupted elves. But
yes.
Were there orcs prior to Middle Earth, or was that a Tolkien development?
It depends on whether or not you want to use that word orc to mean what Tolkien meant it as an orc. There were always bestial versions of humans. If we go all the way back to Epic of Gilgamesh,
stuff, right?
Yeah. So if you go all the way back to Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first monsters that's introduced is this thing called Enkidu. And he's sent by the gods to kill Gilgamesh. And he's this big hulking beast man thing that's all angry and has, bestial power, and he's destroying things. He's running around raging stuff. But when they take him to the city and they give him civilization, he calms down, and he and Gilgamesh become best friends, right? So you have this concept that orcs are built off of, that human beings are are of two natures. There's that old saying about there's two wolves inside of you, and which one you feed is the one that wins. But that's really true, and it becomes a trope because it's based in truth. Stereotypes have grains of truth in them. So you see this twisted elf that becomes an orc in Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien did this because elves were supposed to be perfect creations. They were made by the gods, or made by the first god, to be like this perfect balance with nature kind of thing. And Melkor, the bad guy, decides, I'm going to screw it all up. And I'm going to create these things that break all the rules, that don't follow the guidelines, that go off and do their own thing, that spoil stuff. But yeah, it's part of humans. The dark side of us, and this is in everything. This is the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing. It's the same premise and same concept.
Before we get too far off this, I want to mention, if you want to hear Shane talk more about Lord of the Rings lore, he has currently a 2-part series, and he's going to continue it on the history of Middle Earth mythology, creation, and all that stuff.
That's been really fun. I've had a lot of fun doing that. Super cool stuff.
So we're going to have links to his channel in the show notes, and he's going to have those in his VODs or videos section, which we call VODs. So if you want to hear him nerd out on, like, do an actual presentation on the history of Middle Earth as it is in the Middle Earth itself, that's the place to go for that.
You also outed
one's coming up pretty soon.
You also outed yourself as an author. And
I did.
And you said that you don't like talking about it too much, but I'm wondering if we're going to be able to drag out of you some links to some material where people might be able to find some of that.
If you go to Amazon and type my name in, you can find stuff that I've written.
All right. Well, show notes, folks. But this idea of tropes segues really well into like the next section of questions. Things become cliche and become tropes because they work so well, right? Because they're awesome, and they really hit the perfect vibration for relating to humans, our emotional resonance points. But then they become cliche and they become tropes when it's just like, oosh, you just slide right into that like every time, like just because the groove is like so well worn, it can be hard to like not step in it and then just get stuck. So we're now we again, like, are the larger part of our audience, and then the larger part of the culture that we all live in. Medieval Europe is sort of the default setting and aesthetic for fantasy that gets relied on. To maybe a somewhat lesser degree, there's samurai, ninja, some like Eastern influences. Some of the more like, the bigger mainstream Eastern influences. Pirates. Those are sort of like the big three that come to mind. But what historical cultures, societies, settings are being ignored that you think have as much like rich depth to them that people might be able to go to start trying to like find their way into different kinds of inspiration?
Right. That is such a great question. And the answer is a little bit, and this is just going to sound silly, but every culture has a history that is worth studying. But I know what you're asking is, are there big ones that are out there that have huge impacts on the ancient world and stuff like that? And yes,
we're gonna redeem your rank 3 now.
Yeah. So if you look back in history, there are a lot of things that get overlooked, and this is partially to do with the fact that Western culture that we live in, Western Europe is in, North and South America. We're all sort of dominated by Western themes. And when you go to school, you learn about Rome, you learn about Greece, and you might learn a little bit about, Egypt. But who goes to school and learns about the progressions of the dynasties in China, or the different cultures in India, or the groups of people that developed in Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And there's not a lot of that because, well, first off, there's just not enough time to teach all of it. You know, in Worlds of One, I have to cover everything from the beginning of humanity, from literal humans first becoming humans, all the way through the Protestant Reformation.
Good
And I have
luck.
to do that in one class, and it's a sprint. So you just by necessity have to leave stuff out. I try to hit high notes and I try to be as inclusive as I can. But if you let me teach a class by myself, which is pretty much what I'm doing on my Twitch channel, I would cover so much more stuff. And the big things that I would point people to, if you're looking for the depth of culture that you might have in somewhere like Rome or Greece, where you can go back for hundreds of years and you have evolutions of different artistic styles and writing styles, that same sort of thing exists in Persia, inside of what we would call today Iran. The Achaemenid Persians, the Parthians, and the Sassanids had a culture that stretched centuries that most people today don't really know anything about. They had incredibly detailed art. They had their own very beautiful architectural style. They have their own mythology. They have their own scripture books. The big religion of the Persians is Zoroastrianism, which is something that people might have heard of but don't really know very much about. I could say the same thing about India, but especially if you're looking for art resources, the Mughal dynasty of India, is Mughal. Those guys have absolutely amazing artistic skills. It's the height of art inside of India, and they blend a lot of old Indian themes with Buddhist themes, Hindu themes, Persian influence, influence from other places in China. If you want to go look at China, I mentioned that earlier. Ancient Chinese culture, the height of their artistic style is the Ming Dynasty, and this is something that people might have, like, oh, that's a Ming Dynasty vase. But the reason those are so coveted is because this is kind of the height of their artistic style. But if you're going to look up China, you should also look up the Han Dynasty, which is spelled like Han Solo, and the Tang Dynasty, which is spelled like Tang, T-A-N-G. And the Ottomans. The Ottoman Turks are an empire that lasted for 700 something years, and we don't really talk about them very much. You may have heard about them in World War One, and it's only, hey, the Ottoman dynasty fell apart, but they had incredible advances in calligraphy art. And if you want to do anything like with visual writing, go check out the Ottoman stuff. Their geometric patterns and decorative style is stunning. And I mean, I've been to some of these places where they built this stuff, and it's breathtaking. So Ottomans and the Mughals, and I could give a million answers to that. But if you're just wanting some really big cultures that have a lot of stuff out there that's really easy to find, check those people out. There's so much stuff out there that I would love to just kind of ramble about. But
What are some Googleable locations that, like, for architecture or whatever else that you think that would be, like you said, mentioned places you've been to that people could Google and say, what, there's tons of photos of them now because they still exist.
Right.
These people can use as reference.
Just go to Google Street View and walk around Istanbul. If you want to see some Ottoman art stuff, look at the Blue Mosque. One of the crowning achievements of Ottoman, well, that's not really Ottoman, I shouldn't say that. Well, yeah, I guess okay. You can go look up the Blue Mosque. That's a good one. I'm getting nitpicky with myself. But look up and everybody's sort of seen the tomb of the Dragon Emperor in China, and that's one thing that people have a reference for. But go look up the Forbidden City, where the emperors lived, and just look at the stuff that's in there. Or if you Google, or if you go to, and I know I keep going back to a Google search, but if you go to Google search and put in Ottoman calligraphy, and you end up with people like Bey, who is a really famous calligrapher, you can see all that stuff. The Taj Mahal, if you've ever seen the Taj Mahal, that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about in India. But there's so much out there that if you just Googled any of those cultures and art and clicked over to images, you'll be inundated with stuff.
Yeah, it probably will take some digging because they don't have necessarily the presence in the typical storehouses that we're familiar with. So you have to maybe peel down in some layers. But that would be cool in itself, because along that path, you're probably going to run into a whole bunch of other offshoots, and you could be.
And I will say this: one of the, and this is me trying to find silver linings in things, but one of the benefits of COVID happening last year and still going into this year is that a lot of museums have decided that they're going to put some of their stuff in virtual tours. So like the Imperial Household Museum in Japan, if you want to go walk around in it virtually, you can see items that used to be in the Imperial household. If you go to Google Earth and go to the Palace of Versailles, you can street view inside the Palace of Versailles. You can street view inside the British Museum in London. You can street view inside of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. You can do that in the Met in New York. So that's a great resource that I think has come out of this, where people can't go see things physically anymore, but these museums have recognized, hey, we still want to be open to people. So there is a website, and I can't remember, and I should have looked this up, I apologize, but there's a website that had collected a lot of that came out last year. So if you Google, or if you search for virtual museums, I know that the Smithsonian was getting on board with a lot of that stuff, virtual museum tours, and then sort of figure out, what's there. And I'll say this too, like, if there's anybody out there that feels like you're stuck and you want to look at something historic or talk to somebody, just shoot me a message. I love talking with people that are in that area, mostly because I really enjoy feeling like what I spent my life doing is valuable.
So you should charge $50 an hour for this service.
Hey.
I've considered that. So for the moment, everybody just shoot me stuff on Twitch or come hang out. I don't mind. I understand that skills should be charged, and I'm working towards that. But if you ever need a quick fix, like, hey man, I really want to draw this and I don't know what to draw, shoot me a message. I'd be happy to point you in the right direction. And I do that a lot with art friends. I've talked with several of the people that others might recognize here on Twitch. If you hung around long enough, you'll see me in somebody's room going, hey, you should do this.
So speaking of your Twitch channel, you often will the basis of most of your streams is going through this period of history, what happened where.
Right.
And so there's a lot of stories that come from that. So for a narrative element, people can look to history for these, is not just art, but for also the stories of who fought who over what, and what elements were involved. Most of what we know has been based off of like the War of the Roses, which was used to make Game of Thrones / Song of Ice and Fire. What are some other periods that are easily digestible for people? I know that, like, there's a lot of really interesting history from like the time periods that we don't talk about as much, but like what are some rich elements of stories that people can people looking for narrative elements to borrow from history can find like readily on YouTube for plot elements to steal?
Yeah, so that's the great thing about history right now, is that so much of it is becoming more accessible because of the internet. And if you want to find intrigue, you can find it. The the best places that I would look if you want to try to find like lots of backstabby, underhanded, double dealing kind of stuff. Look up goings on of the Ottoman Sultan's palace. It's called Topkapi. It's Topkapi, Topkapi Palace. Uh, so during the height of the Ottoman Empire, these sultans would have hundreds of wives and hundreds of children, and everybody was like at each other's throats and constantly assassinating people. And there's all this, super political intrigue that a lot of people don't know about. But if you thought that, like, if you dig the whole political faction playing one side off of another thing that's in Game of Thrones, yeah, check out Ottoman politics at Topkapi Palace and the harem there. That's crazy stuff. If you want some really good wars that have, the dramatic turns of fate where the good guys win and you end up with this euchaotic scenario at the midst of nowhere, look up Roman history. One of the things that the Romans really love to do is brag about their military campaigns. Julius Caesar wrote this whole string of basically play-by-play, dissections of his battles when he was up fighting the Gauls. So Caesar's Gallic Wars, you can go read all of this stuff. And it has even battle tactics, like I put my armies here and they attacked with this, then and I pulled out this victory. So, there are things like that all over the place. If you want good love stories, where would we go? Ancient China during the War of the Three Kingdoms. You have all of these stories about how these people end up on the wrong side of the battles, and they're brothers, but they hate each other. And I'm marrying this woman, but she's from the other side of the faction, and that's going to cause political trouble. And we're star-crossed, and I'm putting my faith in this. And the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a big book that was written to discuss this period of time. And if anybody's familiar with video games, if you've ever played Dynasty Warriors or any of those games, that's based in that time period of China. But there's a humongous document that you can go read for that stuff. There's also a little bit of all of that in histories that come out of Arabia. So if you read people like Ibn Khaldun, you're going to get some of that stuff. There's just so many sources that I could just sit here and kind of ramble off. If you had a specific thing that you wanted to look for, I could find something that would approach that. But just letting me go is probably a never-ending story.
We were talking about religion earlier, and
Right.
my mind immediately goes to the Crusades, which
Sure.
each one of those Crusades is its own narrative.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But beyond that, anything like religious conflict that might pop up, like mixing of religion and politics?
Oh, yeah. If you want to read about the first conflicts between Christianity and Islam, you can read some of the Byzantine historians. If you want to read about, so religion's overlapping and coming into contact with each other is very frequent. That happens a lot in India. There's a series of histories that were written by Buddhists and a competing series of histories that were written by Hindus in India that talk all about the political machinations between rulers that started life as one of these religions and then maybe patronized another religion. I was born in a Hindu caste and I became king, and I'm now going to give money to these Buddhists to rebuild their temples. And but that's now making all of the high class Brahmin Indian people very angry because I shouldn't be doing that. And there's an account of this big ruler named Ashoka, who was ruler of the Mauryan Empire, who started off as a pretty horrible guy, and he was nominally a Hindu but didn't really follow very much. And he goes on this great campaign against these enemies called the Kalinga, and basically wipes them completely out. And then, sort of standing in the rubble of their culture, goes, "That was a bad move. I need to find something better to do with my life." And then converts to Buddhism and becomes one of the most popular Buddhist rulers in history. So, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff like that that's out there.
So that's for the actual histories of real world events. But what
Yeah, yeah.
about like stories that were told, narrative stories?
Oh, okay.
No,
Yeah,
that's fine.
so-
That's fine. I was asking for the prior thing, but now I'm also asking for the next thing.
Okay. So if you want like big cultures that have stories, man, there are so many of them out there, and I'll try to stay away from the European ones. But well, actually, let me say this. So here's a question. We've got two really smart guys in here, and me, and
Where?
Who?
You two guys. So here's the thing: like when we're talking about trying to find inspiration from stories and trying to find stuff that we might not know about, do we really know about what we think we know about?
No.
So think about this. We've all heard of Athena. We know Athena was a Greek goddess of victory, but do either of you guys know any myths that concern Athena?
Not since middle school. No.
She had an owl, right?
Yeah. She's the goddess of wisdom, and owls represented wisdom, so she's frequently associated with the owl. But the reason she is associated with wisdom is because her mother was an early wisdom goddess and ended up getting pregnant by Zeus. And there was this story that got told that this chick's daughter was going to end up causing trouble. So Zeus ate her. Zeus ate his wife, or not his wife, his mistress, because she got pregnant and Zeus didn't want to get killed by this person. And then Zeus got a really bad headache, and they cracked open his skull, and Athena popped out. So she's literally the embodiment of wisdom. So I would tell people,
gnarly, man.
like don't discount stuff that you're familiar with. And I know that one of the things that happens really frequently with my students is that they see how excited I get about all these different cultures. And because they don't have a basis in any of this stuff, they kind of shut down, right? They're just kind of imposed with how much is out there and the depth of everything that's out there. But you don't have to start with something like the Tale of Genji from Japan. You don't have to start with something like the Enuma Elish or these things that you've never heard of. Go pick up a copy of Bullfinch's Mythology and read some stories about Zeus and Hermes and King Arthur. Go read the Bible. A lot of people, know all these stories from the Bible, but have you actually read the Bible? Go read Beowulf. Like, everybody probably had to read Beowulf in high school, but did you read it trying to appreciate it, or did you read it because you had to? So people might know the story of Beowulf because they saw the movie or they read the book, 20 years ago. But if you want to draw some cool, rad Viking stuff, go read Beowulf. You already kind of know what's going on. You already have a foot in the door. It doesn't have to be something that's, foreign. You don't have to go read all of the 1001 Nights. You don't have to know who Scheherazade is. If you've seen the movie Aladdin, go read the actual story of Aladdin. You'll be familiar with the characters. If you've seen Little Mermaid, or if you've seen basically any Disney movie, go read the actual story. You don't have to jump in the deep end. You can use what you know to ease yourself into this stuff. You don't have to go off into the crazy world. But if you want to, man, there's so much stuff out there. If we're just talking about like who produced the most writing, man, there are tens of thousands of pages of Chinese stories that go from, very, very basic stuff like local folklore, all the way up to these big epic stories that explain their entire world and how they got there. You can read, and I know I've mentioned this now twice, but the Arabian Night stories that come out of Arabia uh, during that period of kind of the height of the Islamic world. That's really cool stories. There are, because of the internet now, we can read stuff like the entire ancient Mayan creation accounts called the Popol Vuh. You can go read this stuff online. It's been translated into English. The Mayans had just dozens and dozens of stories. You can read entire volumes of these folk stories, the Viking sagas. There are hundreds of pages of those things and dozens of stories. You can go read the Edda, the EDDA. That's the sort of collected work of Viking mythology. So if you know who Thor is, if you've ever seen any of the Marvel Thor movies, and you want to get some really cool inspiration about how the Vikings actually ran stuff, go read the Edda. It's out there. You can find it, and you can Google Edda full text, and it'll pop the whole thing up for you. So
I love this answer to that question. Like you brought it around to something that I don't know why. It's this effort to like go way far out to try and find something new.
Yeah.
But you've pointed out this great thing that it's like, well, the stuff that you thought was old, it's not so much old. It's just the stories that we've been told about these stories is what's old. Right. And there's still so much great stuff in those old stories that, we might be familiar with their current incarnations, but their old source material, which may be easier to find than some of, these, further off texts, still has like so much stuff in it that we have just like, for what we were talking about earlier, you can only teach so much. So even when you are learning these, like God forbid, like all of your encounters with these types of things are from like movies and TV. But right. even if you're learning them in school, maybe the the knowledge that you're getting from that curriculum is maybe a little bit deeper than a movie or a TV, but you can still go so much deeper. There's a question in here that I feel it coming up, and so I don't know. I feel like this intellectual honesty to acknowledge it, so I don't feel like I've just sort of like tried to bypass it for comfort's sake. Before we were starting, Moose, and maybe you want to clarify this question because I don't want to just like speak for you. Had mentioned, maybe wanting to talk a little bit about cultural sensitivity, or like, like when research into culture becomes cultural appropriation. Right. This is a subject that, in current political climate has definitely gained a lot of traction. I think, to some degree, for very good reason. And then like in other places, maybe it's getting used as a weapon where it shouldn't. What are your thoughts on ways to go about researching and incorporating material from sources that doesn't tread into, that cultural appropriation, I guess?
Yeah. So that's something that, that's been kind of an issue for a long time inside of history, especially since the founding of the modern field of archaeology in the 1800s, is this idea of who owns what. And in today's world, in history and archaeology, there's still a lot of like very physical arguments about who owns what, literally who owns what. The best example of this that I can give you are the Elgin marbles. Part of the Parthenon from Athens is in England because this British guy named Lord Elgin stole them, and Greece wants them back, but Britain refuses to give it back. So there's that level of like literal and physical cultural appropriation that's still a very big deal in history and archaeology. But the thing that I would say, if you're going into it with a very clear understanding that this might not be yourself. Like if you don't have any cultural ties to these things and you're trying to understand another person or another group of people or another culture or something like that, you you have to try to put a lot of awareness on your own bias. You have to be very aware of yourself. You have to go into this discussion with the understanding that you are interpreting something that you yourself don't necessarily have any sort of experience with. So if I'm going to research, I'll tell you something that I've been doing lately. One of the things that I'm working on, sort of in my own time right now, is really spending a lot of time examining the history of racism in the United States. And if we're going to talk about cultural appropriation, we might as well just go ahead and hit it right where it is. Let's just be honest about it. There's been a big argument going on in sort of the larger public sphere about the difference between the 1619 project or the 1776 project, and how we're going to teach history in schools, and are we going to teach people about slavery, or how are we going to shape all this stuff and how we're going to frame all this stuff. And it's been tough. So what I've done is I have gone to sources that have come out of the Black and African American community. I have been reading books that people that have been in that scenario, in that situation, have written, and taking their word for it. I haven't gone to this whole scenario going, hey, I'm a middle class white guy with a couple college degrees. I clearly know more about this, and I'm clearly going to be able to properly put all this in historical context, because I was not in the middle of that. I didn't live through slavery. My family, about 3 generations or 4, well, let me see. My family, about 5 generations back, owned slaves. So I had to be cognizant of that, right? But if you're going to explore a culture, you have to be willing to put your interpretation on a little bit of a hiatus. And I'm not saying that you can't parse things for accuracy and compare that to other sources and verify things and, go through the proper motions of, getting multiple opinions and building your case. But, if you're going to, let's say Joby wants to paint a picture of some people from the Ottoman Empire, right? And Joby wants to paint an accurate picture of how these people are experiencing their religion. So Joby wants to paint these people inside of a mosque. Well, you have to be aware of the scenario that that's not something that a lot of people would be very comfortable with. There are a lot of cultural standards and religious ideology within the Muslim community about how to depict individuals and how to depict religious symbols. So Joby might draw that picture, and and I'm gonna try to make Joby the bad guy here. By the way,
he is,
would never
though.
do this kind of stuff.
I would totally do something like this too, just not even know what's going on.
Right. So you have to be aware enough to understand that there are things that you don't understand. Right.
But you
have to be willing to admit, like, I don't know everything about this, so I should try to do my due diligence. I should try to look all this stuff up. I should maybe read some stuff from those people, read some stuff from that culture, try to get a better handle on how I'm going to do this stuff. And I know it sounds like a whole bunch of work, but you could figure that out in maybe 5 minutes of reading. Is you start reading about Islamic images, and if you Google that, the first thing that's going to pop up is Charlie Hebdo drawing Muhammad, people in France getting shot because they had a Draw Muhammad contest, and you're going to go, oh, maybe I need to be a little bit careful about how I draw this picture.
But is there a difference between obviously we've learned that wearing a feathered headdress as a Halloween costume is bad. It's the bad type of cultural appropriation.
Mhm.
But is there a difference between that and like having a fantasy race of, let's say, lizard men in the Warhammer 40K universe where they have
Right.
a feathered headdress?
I don't know if I'm in a position to speak on that. Um, I would say that if you are doing something that is done with an open mind and not to be stereotypical or denigrating, um, you are in a better spot than if you just go into it blind. Uh, but I don't have any Native American ancestry, so I don't know how I would feel about that. And that's the thing we all have to remember is that just because we look at a group of people and think one thing, that's not necessarily how they think about themselves. And this actually gets me um, to something that I do with my students quite a bit. When we get into topics like this, and we talk about cultural appropriation and we talk about stereotyping and identities. One of the things that I ask them is to try to think of one word that completely sums up themselves as an individual. Like you only get one word or one thing that completely symbolizes you as an individual. And then
Boring.
well, I mean, like, well, I don't know about that. People have never given me that one before. Like one noun, not adjective, uh, that completely describes themselves. I can't do that. I could give you son because I'm a son. I could give you husband because I'm a husband. But does one noun completely encapsulate who I am? And 99 times out of 100, people aren't moose, and they go, "No, I can't do that." And then I ask them, "So why do you label other people with one word?" If you don't want, if you can't do it for yourself, how can you justify doing that for an entire group of people? Or, how do we just say, oh, those are Muslim people, or oh, those are Christian people, or those are black people, or those are white people? So you have to be aware that an identity is not just the images and the way that we dress and the way that we are. It's also how we think about ourselves and how we feel about ourselves and how we view the world, and that's a little bit harder to explain sometimes. So I don't know if I don't know. I mean, you do whatever you can, but you also have to be willing to understand that you might goof it up, and when you do goof it up, you just have to own it and try not to do it again.
Yeah, and I guess if somebody comes at you and is like, "Hey, you're treading in some bad territory here," it's worth listening to and not
Oh
just
yeah,
having
absolutely.
a knee jerk reaction to. But it's interesting, that you said, well, you don't know if you're qualified to to answer that question directly, and I definitely see where you're coming from and why you say that. But that one word thing, I think that there's an interesting part of that, that does have like a good answer to it, where Moose was saying like the difference between um, wearing a Native American headdress for Halloween and then creating a fantasy race that has a feathered headdress. So in that, you could imagine like, well, if your fantasy race of lizard men that wore feathered headdresses lived in teepees and like smoked quote peace pipes, and
Right.
and all that kind of crap, well, then maybe you're getting a little bit weird. But if you like are just taking the inspiration of a feathered headdress and you're elaborating on it and turning it into something sort of like new and innovative, like mashing it together with like lots of other things, now you've taken an inspiration rather than appropriation, and you've avoided the one word. So whereas like just like all of the Indian tropes that you could go along with, that with the feathered headdress, that's sort of now you're going into like the one word, that you're describing a culture with the one word. Whereas the other thing is like you're going into all of the variations and textures.
And that gets back to your preparation and your world building. Do you have a reason for that? Are you doing it just because it looks cool? And that's okay. But maybe your lizard race fought with the bird people, and they killed the bird people and took trophies from the bird people, and they wear them into battle to scare the bird people. Maybe you have a reason behind that is yours. But even then, you also have to be careful because you can't just go you know completely copying and pasting stuff. So copying and pasting stuff is just bad.
Yeah, no
cultural
matter what you're looking
appropriation
for.
is like cultural plagiarism, basically. So,
Right. So this also leads into something that's, I think, semi-related. Like if you are seeking inspiration from history, or even you're just researching history, what are the risks of being led astray, and how do we avoid them? We think about the eyewitness account and how this is a notoriously bad source of information. Like talking to somebody who was there at the scene of the crime is not always reliable. So we're talking about people that were at the scene of the crime 1,000 years ago. Yeah. So how do historians account for that? And then like as laymen, who are dummies, how do we account for that?
I don't think anybody's dummy. So there is an entire sub branch of history and linguistics and literature called source criticism. And this is something that came out of the 1700s and 1800s, where people during the Enlightenment period figured out we can't just take everything at face value, right? Like we can't just go, oh, this document exists, so we have to take it for face value. And one of the great examples of this, there's this ancient document that the Catholic Church was using. It's called the Donation of Constantine. And it was this document, and it said that Constantine, the emperor, had donated certain amounts of land and properties and rights to the Catholic Church. And this was something that the Catholic Church had used for a really long time, centuries, to validate certain powers that the Pope had. And during the Enlightenment, this guy decides, I'm going to look at this document. I don't know what this document really says. So let's examine it. And through source criticism, he found out like, oh no, this is a complete forgery. Because the way that the wording is used, they're using words that weren't actually created at that time, and the way that they're phrasing this was not the way that people in the 300s would have phrased this. And he did that by comparing the Donation of Constantine to other existing Latin sources, and kind of sussed out that the church had forged this whole thing, and this whole concept that they were basing it on was just absolute, I mean, it was just made up out of nowhere. So, and that's just one example of this larger concept of source criticism. So there is a lot of that goes on inside of the historical field, where just because we find a document and it says something doesn't mean that we have to accept it for what it says. People in the ancient world are just like us. They
just without the internet.
Well, yeah, I mean, their motivations and their desires are the same as ours. They want to make themselves look better. They're going to sanitize things. They're going to tell the big fish story. Like I caught a fish and it was this big. I fought an army and there were 50,000 men in that army. And so what we have to do is take that as a starting point. And this is where archaeology comes in and comparative literature comes in, because then you have to find stuff that correlates with this material. And sometimes you can work it out and sometimes you can't. We have to take a lot of people at their word sometimes, which is, kind of dangerous. We have only a couple of histories of certain periods of time where, like we have Thucydides, who writes the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. But we know that he fought on one of the sides of the Peloponnesian Wars, but he's writing about both sides of the Peloponnesian Wars. So is the stuff that he's saying about the bad guy really super accurate? Well, how do we know that? Well, we can compare that to architectural stuff where we've dug up the buildings. So Thucydides says, "Oh, we went over here and we sacked this village and we sacked this city and we burned down those cities. So we go dig the city up, and using all these fun archaeological things, we find a giant burn layer that corresponds to that period of time, and we go, oh, he was telling the truth. They really did burn this city, because you look at the wall of the city and it's got 3 inches of ash in it, which shows up in the ancient world. So you compare that to existing archaeological finds, and then you apply common sense. If we know that the city that this guy ruled had about 20,000 people that lived in it, and he said that he fought this enemy and his army was 50,000 people big. We go, no, dude, we know exactly where you lived. You lived in, you lived in the city of Uruk, and we've excavated Uruk, and we know how many people lived in Uruk because we, base how many houses they had, how many people they had in the region based on villages around the region. And we know that you had an army that was maybe 5,000 guys. And you're saying you had 50,000 guys? You're lying. But he did that because he wanted to be the big bad guy, So there's a lot of textual criticism that has gone into our history world, and that happens constantly. And it's not just on ancient stuff. This is stuff that applies all the way across the board. People that were alive in World War I or World War II, or people that were, people are still digging out Freedom of Information Act stuff. It seems like every 3 or 4 months, something pops up out of the American government, and it's like, hey, the government lied to us about this thing. And we now have the textual proof that shows it. So there's a lot of that stuff going on. But if you are just interested in looking up some history stuff, right, you can do that pretty easily. There are a lot of history books out there that are pretty easy to get by. The one thing that I would say, though, actually a few things. Look who the publisher is. If you want to go find a book online, and something that I've said has struck a chord, like, man, I really want to read a book about those Mughal Empire people in India. You can go to Amazon and see who the publisher is, and just go to the publisher's website and see what else they published, how long they've been in business. That doesn't always, mean that everything that they're saying is legit, but if it's Oxford University Press, or if it's Random House Publishing, these big books companies, they're going to have peer reviewers who look at those manuscripts before they ever get published, that are going to put that under a lot of scrutiny and revision. And look at the reviews. Go to Goodreads or Amazon and scroll down and see what people are saying about this stuff. And also look at when it was published. One thing about history is that it changes a lot, and I can't get I can't get certain people to understand how much history changes, because people come up to me all the time, and certain individuals, and I won't name them or even give you certain positions of certain people with some level of authority over me. We'll just say it that way. Are of this opinion that, history is already done, and you don't actually need to keep up to date on this stuff. You don't need to worry about changing your courses or coming up with new ideas or stuff like that. It doesn't take a lot to teach a history class. It doesn't take a lot to keep a history class going, right? But it changes all the time. Like, just last year, we found out all sorts of stuff that we didn't know the year before. And if you look at a history book and it was written, back in the 1930s, well, guess what? That book was written almost certainly with a gigantic Marxist slant, because the people in history that wrote between about the 1920s and the 1960s were almost completely all Marxists. So you might be reading something where they're interpreting all of this through class struggle inside of the culture, but that doesn't mean that it's accurate. It might actually be something totally different, and we know now that examining this through this lens was not the right way to do it. So if your book that you're reading is 100 years old or 60 years old, you might not be reading the stuff that's the best. So check to see when it was published.
But as far as inspiration goes, it doesn't matter if it's accurate or not, as long as it's interesting, right?
Well, yeah, and see, that's the thing. If you're looking for an interesting image, you can find a lot of old books that came out in the early 1900s, and find hardcovers of these things online for $2 or $3. Go look at the old collections that were in the British Museum, or that were in the National Museum in Athens, or the museum in Cairo. You can find these, collections of stuff that they had on display for super cheap online. And if you're just looking for visual stuff, it doesn't necessarily matter too terribly much if you're just trying to get visually inspired. But if you're trying to write a story set in a particular period of time, that's a whole different situation. if you're trying to be historically accurate and you find this statue and this guy says, "Oh yeah, it's from this city," and then we find out, no, it wasn't. It wasn't from there at all. That was traded from this other culture. That stuff happens a lot.
So I'm a bit of a dyslexic moron, and I can't read books. I can't read long text to get more nuanced information out of them. I need either the cliff notes or I need a movie or a TV show to do all that interesting stuff for me. What are some interesting sources that you don't think are like immediately abundant in today's cultural conscience? Like,
so I run a history stream on Thursday nights.
Twitch.tv/ShaneMcInnis.
Yeah, so that's me. And I talk about stuff. Well, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I try to talk about stuff in a very relatable way, even if it's some weird esoteric version of history that a lot of people haven't had access to. I try to break it down like it's just people. But go to a lot of those the web series stuff, and I mentioned this. I use this all the time, but like there's 3 Minute History, which is a series on YouTube. There's Crash Course History, which is a series on YouTube. If you're looking for kind of shorter books that take really big concepts and kind of get them down to the boilerplate, there is a whole series of books that are put out by Oxford University Press called Very Short Introductions. And none of them are over, I think, 110 pages, 120 pages, and they have pictures and stuff too. And all of them are like $7 or $8. And these are really well put together, scholarly, researched books. They get people that are usually scholars in this area that have credentials that put these little short intros together. And there's there's probably 45 of those. They're very short introductions and all the different phases of Rome, all the big ancient religions, India stuff, China stuff, Japan, Industrial Revolution, communism, fascism. If you go to Amazon and just very short introduction Oxford, there are probably now almost 100 of those because they're publishing like 10 or 11 of them a year. So if you don't want to read, a 450 page book and you want to get just like the highlights of something, I would tell you to go there. Those are excellent. I've got about a dozen of them.
In the chat, David Peterson is asking.
We can't hear you, Joey.
In the chat, David Peterson is asking, what about history podcasts? Are there any? You mentioned this earlier that you don't listen to podcasts too much, but are there any that you are familiar with that you would recommend?
There are not any that I'm familiar with, and that's probably a giant gaping hole in my knowledge set. But I don't know of any history podcasts that are that are up there. I know that there were that there are a few on mythology, but I can't remember what the name of it is.
Can I step in for you?
In that for a while and was listening to those. Hardcore History, yeah. So there's one.
Yeah, History on Fire is good too.
But yeah, I'm a horrible source for that.
At this
I decided to make one myself instead of go hang out with everybody else's.
That was going to be one of the things that I wanted to plug in here. You should have a podcast.
Well, I've thought about recording the episodes and putting them up as a podcast, but my technical limitations right now are pretty stretched as it is. And me trying to record things and get capture cards and all of that stuff is just not in the budget.
Fair
well,
enough.
The thing about I can talk about this off stream, but you can actually use OBS to do the recording. And then
and I've tried that. And the process of recording and streaming basically tax out my computer and it starts spinning the hard drive like mad and the fan doesn't shut off and it gets about 5 degrees hotter in the room.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, I need a new computer and I'm working on putting one of those together. And when Bitcoin goes back down to a manageable level and nobody's trying to mine it anymore, I can get another graphics card. But
yeah,
those are about 100% more expensive than they need to be right now.
Well, I think that we're coming to the tail end of this. I always take notes and I print out the outline of our questions, and I always like scribble in notes, and I think like to date, this is the most notes that I have scribbled on the margins and on the backs of the paper. So this was fucking awesome, dude. Thank you so much. Just a couple of questions to tie it all together.
Hit me up.
Yeah, well, where would you like people to find you? We've mentioned and clicked a link about your Twitch channel a couple of times, and that'll definitely be in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that you would like people to find you?
I have social media. I am bad at social media. My Instagram and Twitter is @somehistoryguy, all one word. And you are welcome to follow me there, but I do not very frequently get on there. I started that initially when I was doing my Twitch stream to try to generate some content and some traffic, but people from Instagram don't leave Instagram, and people from Twitter don't care about Twitch very much in my experience. It's different for art because you all have something visual to show off. If I'm just posting a tweet that's like, hey, I'm a guy and I come talk, so come talk to me, it's a little bit harder to generate that stuff, but it's there. I also have a Discord where I hang out pretty frequently, and if you go to my Twitch page, there's a link to that, and I think Joey's going to post a link to that too. That's
definitely
the social media that I use the most, and I quite like that. I like the ability that I can give answers to people, and if get into a good conversation, we can just click the button and we can talk with each other. Because a lot of this stuff, as has been very clearly shown today, I can ramble, and if people go, "That's not what I want," and I've rambled for 15 minutes, I can tell by looking at them like, oh, they're cutting out on me. So check me out on Discord. Come to the Twitch channel. I stream every Thursday night at 1900 hours Central Standard Time. I stream every other Tuesday. Sometimes we do multiple Tuesdays in a row, doing viewer request stuff, because I wanted to be able to talk about my history that I wanted to talk about in historical order, which we do on Thursday night. But then I also wanted to answer what people wanted to talk about. So on Tuesdays, every other Tuesday usually, we have a viewer request. So the next one coming up is on the 16th, and we're doing history of pirates, which is what the crowd wanted to do. And we did Japanese mythology last time. So
have you considered co-streaming to YouTube?
I have considered that. I don't know, with the limitations I have on hardware, if that's going to be something that would work.
My understanding is that you stream to one place, and then that one place then splits the feed.
Yeah. Restream.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, so I'll have to check that out.
Just don't tell Twitch.
There's a whole big crowd over there, and I need to get one of those little bots that loops everything back into Twitch for chat and stuff. So,
and for the viewers who are watching this visually, they saw a puppy leave your stream.
Yes.
And they should know that one of the point redemptions on your Twitch channel is to call the puppy to receive pets and all that stuff.
Yeah. The dog's name is Kaylee. She's named after Kaylee Fry, the mechanic on the Firefly ship Serenity. So we're nerds all the way around. I've got all kinds of stuff in the walls behind me. They're Gundam models and Transformers and all kinds of stuff like that. So we have. And
now's the part of the show where we talk about the inspiration between it goes into Firefly.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that for a while too, but
that's American history. Who wants to know anything about that?
Well, I could talk about American history until everybody's tired of listening.
We'll
might not be too fast.
We'll have you back for that.
Hey man, yeah.
But one more question before we fully end it. Outside of work, what's something that is happening in the world that you're excited about?
So I have watched the show long enough to know that question was coming, and I've thought about that probably longer and harder than any of the other questions that I thought might come up today.
And the answer is nothing.
No. Man, I'm excited about a lot of stuff, but I'll say this, and I want to preface this whole answer with this is not me trying to fan service Joby and Moose or blow smoke up Joby and Moose's rear end. I love the fact that people are getting interested in history, and I love the fact that the internet lets that happen. I mentioned this up at the top, and I'll come full circle to say history doesn't have to be boring, and I'm so glad that there are ways that I can get to people that are interested in history, that want to learn stuff, that don't have to do this in a way that they're forced to. You know, everybody's got to go to history class, and it makes it boring, or you get taught history by a coach who's more interested in the game Friday night than the subject that he's teaching. The fact that there are people that are interested in this stuff, the fact that it is applicable to people's lives, and the fact that people are figuring that out, just it makes me happy. When I first started my stream, I had very low hopes. I was worried that my affiliate would get taken away because I didn't get high enough viewer ratings and all of that stuff. And it has been amazing to me how much people have responded to this kind of stuff. And it's not just me. I'm glad that people are interested in learning across the board. And I'm so glad that we live in a time period where that is able to happen. People ask me all the time, if you could go back and live in any period in the world, when would you go back and live? And I would say right now. I know that's
we
kind
get
of
to see the end of it all. That's the important part.
Well, I mean, we have medicine and we have electricity, and I can go get a burger from a shop and I don't have to cook it. And we have everything that we have, but we have this amazing tool called the internet that is the greatest single invention that humans have ever made. And it has been used mostly for pornography and cat pictures, but people are figuring out that you can use it to learn, and that there is stuff out there that you can go find, and you don't have to go just to some, Ivy League college to learn about this stuff. You can go find it if you just look for it a little bit.
And it also brought us QAnon, so.
Well, yeah, it did. And it brought a whole bunch of stuff that
never happened.
Is not so great, but I mean, that's what happens with any new technology, So, but I'm glad that people are excited about learning, and not just about history, but just about everything. And that's really, really gassing my gears up. I was so excited about doing this. I was so stoked the whole week.
Well, that makes me happy to hear, man, because it was mutually beneficial for sure. It was a lot of fun. So thank you again very, very much, man. Look forward to seeing you again soon. I'm going to wave goodbye, and then I'm going to hit the end of the record.